So good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to the second of our webinars. Last Friday, our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar set out his plan for a phased reopening of Ireland. He has 5 phases in his plan. For most employers planning their own phased return, this has some built-in time for that planning to happen. Unfortunately, there's very little guidance as of yet as to what employers should do or how they are going to manage this phased return. Maybe that guidance will come, maybe it won't. I'm not entirely sure how far up the food chain it is in terms of agenda items. But the Employment and Benefits Practice in Mason Hayes and Curran has been giving quite a lot of thought to this, and we've been discussing it amongst ourselves. And we've been talking in particular about the issues and the exposures employers might face in managing return to work, either whole scale at the beginning, but for most people, it will be a phased return to work. And what we want to do today is to share some of our thoughts, share some of our insights. But there is one thing that we're very, very clear about, excuse me, and that is that much of this is going to center around the health and safety of employees. With that in mind, I am joined today by my partner, Liz Ryan. I will hopefully be joined by my other partner, Ger Connolly, who's having some IT difficulties. But we're both, Liz and I, and Ger, when he gets in, we're delighted to be joined in particular by Michael Young, who is the founder and managing director of Vision Safety Consultants. Vision Safety Consultants are a specialist occupational safety, health and welfare consultancy. And we've been chatting to Michael a lot over the course of the last few days about the kinds of things employers should be thinking about. So with that in mind, I think we're going to jump right in. And Liz, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you, please. What kinds of things should employers be thinking about as regards getting their employees back into work, and specifically on the employment law side?
Absolutely, Melanie. Obviously, as you said, Michael will be covering the health and safety, physical type issues, but the employee considerations really are about the mechanics of getting employees back into the workplace, where that is their normal place of work. And many of our clients are actually busily in planning phase at the moment. I suppose some of the major types of initiatives that have come out of that planning are measures such as having a phased return to work, so that employers can ensure that there's physical distancing and that it can reduce the risk of the virus, of virus transmission. Now, that phased return to work, some of the employment law considerations would be around: how do you step that phasing? Who do you ask to return to the workplace in the first instance? Do you look at people who cannot work remotely and have them return to the workplace first? And how do you deal with people who, for example, because of childcare issues, cannot return to the workplace when employers reopen the workplace in or around the 10th of August or maybe slightly before then, particularly in circumstances where creches are only going to commence reopening from July 20th on a day-a-week basis. 2 other initiatives worth mentioning. One is that some employers are splitting their teams to reduce the risk of cross-contamination, and also to ensure that their key people and their key teams can continue to work on a skeletal basis. Now, it is important when you are splitting teams to consider who you need in a team and how you're going to split that team so that you can maintain that skeletal staff. Another initiative is around employers now looking at flexible hours. So where they would have typically had a 9-to-5 workplace, splitting the workplace so that you have one shift of people, if you like, working from 8 to 4 and another from 4 to 12. It is important that employers, though, do leave an air gap, which is a period of time when employees are not physically in the workplace, to ensure that it's cleaned properly. It is also sensible for employers to consider doing a survey of their employees to see what their employees' needs are and their employees' abilities are, obviously reserving the right ultimately to decide who should return to work in the first place and the phasing. That's the employer's prerogative. But doing the survey is a very effective way of gathering information as to what suits your employees and what will work for them.
Speaking of surveys, of the 270 people who responded to our survey yesterday, 76% of people said that, our respondents said that they had started planning the phased return to work. And of that 76%, 51% said that they had started thinking about health and safety concerns. Michael, I want to talk to you now, because your view on specifically what employers should be thinking about in a health and safety context.
Yes, Melanie, absolutely. I suppose the key thing here is to be organised in your thinking. So we would say that the first thing you do is you start to risk assess and start a risk assessment. This is important because risk assessment is required under the law, and all work should be risk assessed. And also then when you're putting mitigation in place, it's important that you document what you're doing. And also the risk assessment will make you think holistically about your premises and your staff, and it'll prevent you from making panic buys and spending money incorrectly. So we're noticing with some of our clients is that they're coming to us and we're having to wind back from what the mitigation, and sorry, I use the word mitigation. A mitigation is a measure that you put in place where you see a risk. So a mitigation is something that reduces or gets rid of that risk. And we're seeing that our clients are putting mitigations in and they're not always correctly thought out. So that risk assessment is your starting point. We'd also say that you risk assess, you put in measures, but none of this is of any use unless you inform your staff about what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And you can't assume that your staff have an inbuilt knowledge of what's going on here. So you have to start at the beginning. So you tell them what it is, what we're protecting against, why we're protecting against it, and how we're protecting against it. And this is the only way that you're going to build a culture of protection and of good behavior patterns. And that culture is what's going to make this work or not work. And then also you need to look at waking your building up. So if your building has been largely dormant, you may need to do a deep clean on the building. You may need to look into your systems like your air conditioning systems or your water systems and do a Legionella check. So you need to consider the facility itself. And then your communications, how are you getting this information out? And you remember we were saying before that for me, it's too late if you wait for your staff to turn in on Monday morning and go, okay, guys, we're going to teach you about what's going on here. They need to know in advance of coming into work so that the minute they leave their front door, they're behaving correctly in terms of protecting themselves and they understand what they're coming into and how it's going to work.
So Michael, risk assess, document it, communicate it, and then you mentioned teaching then. So training is an important part of that, probably part of the comms piece.
Yes.
And there was a couple of kind of specific areas that we've been discussing over the last few days, you know, like entrances and lifts, and talk to me about a couple of those.
So if you take, we would always say, and you know, when we're teaching the risk assessment, there's a couple of things. People go, well, how do we start? Because it's quite an onerous, if you've not done it before, it's quite an onerous thing to start. So really risk assessing is you're identifying hazards and you're going, how can we make this hazard, can we reduce it to an acceptable level or get rid of it? And you just start at the beginning. So we would say, and not just in the office or in the place of work, maybe start at people traveling to work. So are they using public transport? Are they driving? Is that somebody who used to pool a car? Should they travel individually? How do they look after themselves on public transport? And then and just go through the building bit by bit. Starting maybe at the entrances, access points. Is a reception desk there? Does that reception desk maybe need a screen around it? You see it in shops quite often, they're putting perspex screens up. You know, do we need something like that for our receptionists? How are we using our lifts? Should we have it one person at a time in the lifts, or should we encourage stairwell use so that those that have to use the lifts can use the lifts? Identifying vulnerable staff. I think that that's quite important as well, that we see, you know, are there people who potentially should remain working at home? Circulation within the building, your sanitary facilities, how you're managing those, and what are you going to put in place? What mitigation are you going to put in place? So it's just a matter of, in order, going through the working of the building and of the staff within the building. and trying to identify the risks.
And Ger, I want to come to you now that we have you. You're very welcome and thank you for joining us. What about an employee who can't or who won't come back to work? Because I think that's a question on everybody's minds.
Yeah, I think it's, I think we have to divide them into two categories. The can't, from our survey results, I think 13% of people said that they may have childcare issues. And we saw an article in the paper on Monday, I think, where 2/3 of young working women have said that this may be a difficulty. I think in relation to I can't return to work, I think an employer is going to have to look at what reasonable is, and what reasonable was maybe 2 months ago, what's reasonable now is going to be different. And I think they're going to have to work through that. For example, can the employee work flexible hours? Can they work later into maybe do work during the night? And we should remember that the Workplace Relations published a code of practice on how to deal with part-time requests and things like that, and they're still very relevant. And then if you get into a situation where the practicalities aren't working, maybe that employee can take parental leave, which will again bring them maybe much further into the year, or even perhaps into even next year, where creches and things will be back open. So I think before any employer makes a decision about the termination of a person's employment, I think they'll have to look at the reasonableness of that decision in much more detail. In relation to those who won't come back to work, it's interesting in a survey that was done last week, 41% of people said they have a fear of going back into the workplace. And that fear is obviously amplified because they would maybe using public transport and various other things. Where an employee has a fear of returning to work, I think it's important that the employer works with them to see is A, is a genuine fear, or B, is it like, years ago when we had the concerns about asbestos, there was asbestos in the building and no one would ever enter the building. But can we work through, is either, do they have an underlying condition? Is it a genuine fear? Or is it just simply, which may lead to disciplinary action, just simply a reluctance, as in, I just don't want to come back because I like working from home now, because my life is much more easier than having to have the travel time and maybe avoiding various meetings and other work obligations. So I think we need to be much more mindful of what is reasonable now versus what was reasonable maybe 3 months ago.
And I think that's something we've been saying repeatedly, be reasonable, particularly if the employees fall in the can't category. If they fall in the won't, ask why. And if it's a barefaced refusal with no kind of genuine or valid reason, consider discipline. Okay. It's interesting in the results, and you've seen the results of the survey, Michael, 42% of our respondents said that they don't anticipate their workplace reopening until August or September. Another 32% said June. Actually, 7% said late 2020 and 2% said early 2021. That kind of tallies with the communication from Mr. Varadkar and the government that those who can work from home should continue to work from home. But that's interesting, and we've spoken about this a little bit already, but talk to us specifically about an employee working from home, because an employer's health and safety obligations aren't limited to the four walls of the office block. That is somebody's dining room table, and I've said that before, that's where I'm sitting, or somebody who is lucky enough to have some office space like you, or there's lots of people around the place sitting on the sides of their beds with their laptops, which is, maybe okay and tolerable for a few weeks, but in the long term, it's something that can be tricky and can expose employers. So what should they be thinking about?
Well, I think in the initial close up, which was such a shock to the system for everybody and all businesses, we accepted that we all had to row in and we all had to go home and work from the kitchen counter or the kitchen table. But I think that if you're going to say, and quite a lot of companies are saying, and a lot of our client companies are saying, look, we envisage a more permanent work from home solution, and even when this whole thing is over, this may remain. And I think at that point, our attitude would be, well, we have to look at our staff's ergonomic situation. it's not good enough for somebody to sit hunched at the end of their bed working indefinitely. And they are working for us. They are at work. Now, you had mentioned to me previously that a company was looking at a questionnaire that they were sending out to staff, and that it was a very, very
29
long,
pages it was.
29, yeah. And when you're looking at safety and health, if your systems become so unusable that people are reluctant to use them, you're no longer promoting safety. In fact, what you're doing is exactly the opposite. You're driving people away from safe behavior because it's too much hassle. So I would think that you want some, I would have thought a page of a questionnaire should be enough. You should be able to get this into a page. But again, a questionnaire, for example, for ergonomic assessment, and I think that for work at home, ergonomic assessment is something that companies should concentrate on. You have to teach them how to do this. I mean, they have to understand what an ergonomic assessment is. And the question we were asked was, well, look, should the employer be visiting homes to assess people's workstations? And the employee, employees don't have to let you into their homes. It's their home. And the other thing is that that's just not feasible or practical. So what we have to do is teach them how to ergonomically assess yourself. And then the regulations allow for that. So you have to give them the information so that they understand what ergonomic assessment is about, how it works, why it's good for them, and then let them assess themselves. And it may be a case that you come back and go, well, look, you don't have a good enough office chair. Can we help you? Maybe we can put some budget towards getting you a decent office chair if you're going to be working from home long time.
There's a question there, Michael, in the question and answer session, most of which I will come back to at the end, hopefully. But there's one there, actually, I think it's an interesting one. Should a risk assessment be done by directors, or should we get a specialist in who does it? I think probably two answers to that, depending on what you're talking about. Would I be right?
Yeah. So a lot of risk assessment, it doesn't have to be done by the directors of the company, but I would advise directors of a company or those in the positions of authority to look at the risk assessments. And a risk assessment is a live, ongoing, living document. And what happens is, we mentioned very long documents before. People very rarely take things out of risk assessments, but they're quite free to add things into risk assessments. So it takes a brave safety assessor to take something away, because you'll never be punished for leaving it in, if you know what I mean. But yes, I think that people in responsibility should look through their risk assessments and make sure that they make sense, and that if they see anything that has been missed, and yes, there's no harm in getting your safety consultant to have a look through the risk assessment and maybe visit your workplace. It's very, very hard to assess a workplace without actually physically going there and look at it. And anybody ringing us today, we would say, we'll come and look at your workplace before we give you any feedback on how we would tackle this.
So a health and safety consultant for a physical work site or a building. But,
yes.
But if I'm picking you up on what you said about the home working, that you can train employees to check their own workspace, and that should suffice for people who are working at their dining room table or their bedroom or whatever.
Absolutely. And I mean, you might go to your safety consultant or your safety team and go, look, develop a little course that they can take on home, get that information out there. Don't just say, there are the regulations, read the regulations and sort yourself out. We need to approach it in a more proactive way. So, you might do an online course on how to set yourself up, ergonomically assess yourself. You could even put a little exam or a test into that. But then they can go and they can tick box, or they can tick box assess themselves after that. But at least they understand what it is they're doing and trying to achieve.
And Liz, turning to you then, if somebody self-assesses their workspace at home, and to Michael's point, when the organisation looks at the assessment and feels that maybe the employee would benefit from a better chair or a better desk in their home working space, is that an employer's obligation to take that, to cover the cost of that?
I certainly think it's reasonable for an employer to consider it, Melanie. I suppose the only caveat is that we are in ad hoc home working scenario at the moment. So it's unlikely that employers will have had the facility of assessing the home place, as Michael has said. But I think if remote working becomes a longer term prospect, as Michael said, it is a place of work. The employer is responsible for it. And certainly I would think it's not unreasonable for employers to consider giving some sort of a budget to employees to buy the desk and the chair. Normally employees are taking home at the moment, and will continue to do so, the laptop and their IT equipment. But when it comes to equipment such as desks and chairs, I think it's not unreasonable for an employer to be asked to consider making a contribution to ensure that the quality of the desk and chair is fit for purpose.
And I've seen employers say, here's a link to one that's available from IKEA, and here's the cost, and you can expense it, as opposed to putting somebody's office chair in the back of a taxi and sending it out. Ger, there are other things employers need to be thinking about in the context of people working from home. Talk us through a couple of those.
Yeah, I think you shouldn't forget that, you know, when you're working from home, the normal policies will apply, the normal working hours will apply. We need to be conscious of the fact that where a person is working from home, that their working hours may be longer, but you still have an obligation to ensure that they're taking the necessary rest breaks, that they're not working over 48 hours a week. And the normal, and it may become something we have to get used to, that a grievance and a disciplinary will actually be dealt with over Zoom like this. So I think we should not forget that the policies that are in existence still are in existence, and employment rights are just the same when you're in your person's, you know, a person's working from home as they are in the office. And might have been additional layer of policies that maybe, and we all speak about policies should be actually a workable document that people are familiar with. Policies such as, you know, the new policies, or should I say additions to policies about sick leave and how we report sick leave and how we deal with, you know, self-isolation or wherever we come to that. So I think what we will see is the policies that we're always familiar with probably some new ones being added on. And perhaps we're going to have, like for lots of companies, you're going to have a working from home policy, which is very few and far between at the moment, but it might be standard in the next coming weeks.
Okay. I want to come back to you then, Michael, because when we do have people back in the workplace, whether that starts happening in June, whether it starts happening in August, whether it starts happening in September, what then if somebody in the workplace, and Liz kind of helpfully talked earlier on a little bit about kind of, you know, staggering shifts and trying not to mix shifts. So if one person becomes contaminated, then there's another shift available to take over. But what are an employer's obligations when a person presents with symptoms in the workplace? Have you any guidance around that?
Yeah, yes, good question. And the NSAI have a set of guidelines. And I'll give you the name of the document now in a minute. But one of the things that you have to do is you have to have what's called a response plan. And given the current times, I mean, that's only prudent that you would consider a response plan. And part of that response plan is that you would have somewhere to take that person. So you'd have a designated area for someone to go if they start either showing symptoms or they come to you and say that they're not feeling well or not feeling comfortable. And that room to be reasonably well appointed. It should have windows or a good ventilation system. It should be equipped, so you should have things like sanitizer in it, and also PPE. So if you're dealing with somebody who potentially is giving you the symptoms of COVID-19, you should potentially now look at putting on PPE, which in this instance would be a face mask and gloves. But I have a strong caveat with PPE. And the regulations are very clear. When you issue PPE, you have to give training in the use of that PPE. And particularly in the case of gloves and face masks, donning and doffing, which is putting on and taking off, that is a time that you're at risk of contamination, cross-contamination. So it's very, very important that people are taught the correct procedures there. So yeah, you need to have a response plan, and it would be very wise to have a response plan.
Ger, one for you. Actually, just before I move on to Ger, that NSAI document is not specifically about phased return to work or return to work, but it's something I'd commend everybody to read, because I think there's some very helpful and easy tips in there as well. Ger, big question on everybody's mind. Can we test employees' temperatures when they're coming into the office?
Yes, you can. It's interesting in that actually the HSE's guidance at the moment is still has remained was at the start of March, in that they're not overly recommending it because of for mixed results. But the answer is yes, you can. The Data Protection Commissioner said that they don't want to be, you know, that data protection is not going to be a blocker to doing these things, but people must also respect the rules that are in place in terms of it must be transparent, the reason must be known, and that we simply comply with, you know, how we store the data. There's also guidelines, which is, I think, will be published because they're certainly been published in the UK about how would you go about it. Back to Michael's point, you know, a person needs to be trained on the PPE, you know, in terms of who's that person and who the person is going to take the temperature. But in general, the answer is yes, subject to the normal data privacy concerns.
And then Liz, one for you. Can employers insist that employees are medically certified as fit to return to work?
The answer to that is yes. Also, Melanie, it'll be easy for employees who've been diagnosed with COVID-19 to provide a certificate of fitness, because it's very likely they will have engaged with their GP or a hospital. It's a little bit more complicated where somebody has self-isolated. They may not have consulted a medical practitioner, and an employer may see some resistance in employees who fall into that category for that employee to go to see their GP and expend the cost to get a medical certificate. And also, we know from clients that there are some employees who've experienced difficulties in accessing GPs. In those situations, the options open for an employer are to send the employee to the company doctor, or put in place a self-certification type of system. The CIF have done that, and there's an outline of that system in its most recent guidance for construction workers to return to work.
Okay, thanks, Liz. There's another piece that I want to talk about, and I'm going to come back to you, Michael, for it, because if I look at our own office space, we have a building, we have our own employees, we can risk assess the building, we can help people to risk assess their own personal workspace at home. But also in the building, we have pockets of employees who are not our employees, they're employees of contractors. So, and I think most organizations will be similar, because they'll have external cleaning contractors or external security staff or external caterers. For us, we have external post and print room staff. How does that work from a health and safety perspective and from a risk assessment perspective?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because this affects nearly every business. If you have a premises, somebody is going to come to service the photocopier or do something, and they are a contractor or a subcontractor. So what we do, and we do quite a lot of work with clients where we have huge amounts of contractors and subcontractors coming onto either premises or sites. And what we say is, these are our risk assessments and standards. So this would be your company's risk assessment and standards. We need to see yours. We are not really about commenting on your areas of expertise. So if you have contracted catering to a catering company, really we're not here to talk to them about how they cook. That's their area of expertise. But where they interact with our building and building systems and our people, that their systems at the very least comply with our risk assessment. So if their systems are above our risk assessment, if they're better, that's fine. But if they're substandard or a lower standard, then that's when we need to say, no, guys, you know, we want you to act in accordance with our risk assessment. And my opinion would be, as a safety officer, that if I'm the safety officer for my business or representing my business, then I have the right to say that to contractors coming in, particularly in this time of COVID-19, where, you know, this was not something that 2 years ago we anticipated. So we are all having to react to this, and the contractors have to play ball here as well.
Okay. Ger, from an employment perspective, because we've always got this challenge with getting too involved with contractors.
Yeah, I think we've always had this fear of, and we always recommend to clients that they keep the contractors at arm's length. And we obsessed about control and things like that, that we're not seen to be controlling them. And I think, there's, to Michael's point, there's going to be, it seems that the health and safety overlaps, so you're going to maybe have to have a conversation, but not maybe perhaps with the employee, but the main contractor themselves, if you see practices that you are, you're kind of fearful of. So I think from a kind of, there's probably going to be a slight more control, or put it this way, certainly more instruction. I think one final point is that there seems to be a debate going on at the moment about the liability that a company may have for those contractors in your premises. COVID-19 is now deemed an infectious disease, and where you are reckless or irresponsible in relation to and perhaps your office becomes a hotspot for infection, that you could be exposing not just yourself to claims from your employees, but those of a contractor. And I think these are the topics that's going to have to be teased out in the coming months.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going to have to be teased out, and for anybody listening, none of us assume we have all of the answers, and for a lot of these questions there are no right or wrong answers. And actually there's lots of questions coming in. Ger, one that you covered a little bit, we might just go back to it because it's come in a few times. Can an employee refuse to return to work because they're simply worried about their health and safety? Or they're worried about the workplace?
I think it has to be justifiable, and this is where we're going to have to tease it out. Like we're going to be facing some very interesting as an example, which could be a common example, is that one, I have childcare, but you could have where it's not the employee, they could be caring for an elderly parent in their house and saying, it's my circumstances, but where an employee refuses, you're going to have to again strike this balance. Is it a reasonable refusal, or is it just simply refusal? And then I think what we'll have to look at in greater detail is that the ability to perform the work, or where the ability is to perform the work, or is an employer being adamant, I just simply want the concept of a team in my office under my roof. I think one thing that the last few weeks have probably taught us is that we actually can work better. We can work remotely. It has limitations, but I think it's going to be an employer who dismisses the employee for what might seem as a frivolous or unreasonable rejection to return to work. It will pose interesting questions for perhaps the workplace relations when we get there.
Mm. And Michael, there's some interesting questions here for you, and they're actually ones that we've discussed but maybe haven't covered in the last half an hour or so. Questions in particular around toilets and canteens.
Yeah. So if we just take a typical scenario of toilets where you have an office floor with maybe 50 people on it, and you have a male and female toilets, maybe three units per toilet. If you do a phased return to work, where maybe you have 20 or 30% of your staff on the floor at any one time, you could look to, instead of having the locks on the individual cubicles, you just put the lock on the outside door, and it's one person in, one person out, because you're remembering that you've only got 20% of the need and the use on those facilities. So, you might need to be creative about how you reduce the numbers, because toilets tend to be spaces where you're kind of brushing past people, and so they would be high risk. The other thing is that you must provide the sanitation in a toilet, correct sanitation facilities. So a couple of things that we've seen, common mistakes, is people have taken out towels and put in air blowers. Well, if you had somebody who was symptomatic, who was asymptomatic maybe, weren't aware that they were symptomatic, and they use an air blower, what in fact they're doing is they're taking the aerosolized pathogen and they're spreading it around in a warm air current. So we would say air blowers would be discouraged. Put in hand towels, disposable hand towels. So everything is, and we're doing some work with the HSE, and I was talking to facilities guys, and they say, the only thing that goes with the word sterile is disposable. So we used, for this period of time, we used disposable hand towels. Within dining rooms, again, you should look to, that 2 meter rule starts to come into play here. And the other thing as well is that maybe a culture of clean before when you arrive, clean when you leave. So if you sit down to eat your lunch, the surface you're at is cleaned twice. It's cleaned now as you arrive, cleaned when you're finished eating. And again, if you're going to do that, you have to provide the materials to do that cleaning. So maybe something like an isopropanol, something, an atomizer that they can quickly clean the surface and move on. So there are solutions that can be found like that. Again, you have to look at each workspace.
And then another one for you, Michael, and then I'll move on. What about screens? What about hot desking? Yeah,
so hot desking is something that's come into play with some of our clients.
Isn't it?
Yeah, so what we've done, we're actually working with a company, and they had an idea, which was a little hand sanitizer station that has a hand sanitizer and an atomizer, that when you, and just like the dining space, when you arrive at a workspace space, you clean it, clean the keyboard, clean everything that you're using, and think in terms of touch points. So a touch point would be your mobile phone is an obvious touch point. If you're sharing a keyboard, the keyboard is the touch point, the on-off button on a screen, photocopiers. So there, you may have your own desk, but we may share the photocopier. So again, I would allow for a little sanitization station there where you can quickly clean off the photocopier before you use it. And again, when you're hot desking, wipes, a sanitizer, an atomizer, give the workstation a 2-minute clean. And I think now more than ever, the clean desk setup is the ideal setup. In other words, if you're hot desking, the rule is the desk is utterly clean of everything when you arrive and utterly clean of everything when you leave. There's no paper or materials on the desk.
Presumably, Michael, then we're back to the point you made earlier on, that you can't just leave the sanitizer there. You need to train people how to do it. So you have another little webinar there or something. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a question for you then, and it's one that's come up a few times. How does an employer identify a vulnerable person?
Well, normally, Melanie, a vulnerable person will identify themselves to the employer by talking about a potential disability, or that they're vulnerable as a consequence of sharing accommodation with a person who has a disability. Employers, need to be quite careful about making two inquiries that might be seen to be a bit too probing of an employee to determine if they're vulnerable. But what an employer should do is certainly make it known to the employees as a whole that if anybody has a particular vulnerability, and it goes back to Jer's point about coming forward, talking to the employer about the vulnerability, about the reasonable accommodation that they might need for that vulnerability, and for the employer then to consider if they can, from a financial perspective, from a working perspective, accommodate that.
Okay, and then being careful, obviously, with the data privacy implications as well.
Yeah.
Okay. There's lots of people asking if there's one-page template risk assessments. The answer to that is no. It's something that has to be designed with each organization and each workspace in mind. Jared, there was one for you. You mentioned an employee who couldn't come back to work going on parental leave. There's a question here to ask whether putting somebody on unpaid leave, I suppose, or agreeing with somebody that they go on unpaid leave, is that an option?
Yes, it would be an option. You could agree it for a period of time. Yeah, they could go on unpaid leave.
Okay. I think lots of the other questions we have answered. One more here actually, Liz, I think for you. If somebody's spouse is high risk or is cocooning, is that a reason for an employee to remain out of the workplace, if you like?
Right. So What I would recommend employers do in a situation like this is to get some more information, Melanie. And it's not unreasonable to ask the employee in that type of situation to ask their doctor or their spouse's doctor to write a letter to the company explaining the reasons why the person's working spouse may need to take time off work to cocoon or isolate with them.
Okay. And Ger, I'm going to leave the final one with you because there's a few questions here about the application of the phased return. If an organisation has enough space, limited interaction, and can facilitate the social distancing and has done their risk assessment and created the documents and done their training, do they have to wait until the 10th of August? Or could they start bringing people, some or all of their people, back sooner? I don't know if there's an answer to that, but it's something that's been asked a few times.
Yeah, I think the recommendation at the moment is that unless you're an essential service or you have to carry out your work from the office, that actually you remain out of the office until August. So I think the answer to that question is that we need to follow the guidance, and the guidance at the moment is not to have a stampede back into the office. You can, even if you have the space and you have the ability and you're all set to go, it seems that there's no law against it, but the recommendation is that you follow the guidance and not do it until August.
Okay. Any final words from anyone? I think we've run out of time. Michael, any final top tips?
No, I think risk assessment, start at risk assessment and work back from there before you start spending money on things that you haven't fully considered. That would be my top advice. Yeah,
and different risk assessments for the building and somebody's home space, and be sure and document it and then communicate and train. I think if there's anything I've gotten out of our last few conversations, it's the importance of doing that. Can I just say, Michael, on behalf of Liz and Ger and the rest of the Mason Hayes and Curran team, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. I hope our listeners did as well. Ger, Liz, thank you both very much as well. Everybody stay safe, and hopefully we'll get to meet again in the not too distant future. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.